everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Happy Hour for Monday, August 7th. Who'd have thought that we'd already be in August? This year is flying by. Always a pleasure to see you all here in the Zoom room on Monday night. I'm your host, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. My name is Sean Hall, and with me as always is the Executive Director of the VBC, Todd DiPastino. Todd, how you doing tonight?
Good. Happy Pearl Harbor Day. Purple Heart Day. Purple Heart Day.
Take two. That's what we say in the acting world. Take two. Purple Heart Day. We're going to talk more about Purple Heart Day maybe later on in the program. We have a wonderful guest tonight, Marv Truhe. Marv, you want to wave your hand?
Yeah.
Good evening. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Wonderful. We're going to get to you in just a few minutes. Love seeing everybody here on tonight, Brad. It's always a pleasure. I know that we were talking in the room earlier. Marv said, "What is the kind of age range that we usually have here at our events?" And we said everyone from as young as 15.
Henry
Shepke, 15, all the way up to the wonderful Julia Parsons here with us tonight. But thank you all for being here. Again, this is the Veterans Breakfast Club, and our mission is creating communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. Todd and I are not veterans. We are civilians, but we have a passion for veteran stories, and we've been doing this. Well, Todd's been doing this for 15 years. I've been with him for about 3 years. So excited to bring you the program tonight. And before we get to Marv and his wonderful book Against All Tides concerning the USS Kitty Hawk's race riot, we want to thank our sponsors. Well, mainly, I would say sponsor. Todd, I'm going to go ahead and stop your share if that's okay.
Yep.
And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we have tobacco-free Adagio Health, who have been a longtime supporter of the VBC. They are dedicated to reducing and preventing tobacco use and to getting the word out about the hazards of smoking and secondhand smoke. They are all about health, so they want people to quit. They have classes, nicotine replacement therapy, and they have a popular quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. You can type that into your phone, 1-800-QUIT-NOW, and talk to somebody immediately. They also educate people as children, especially about tobacco use, from cigars, cigarettes, pipes, chew snuff, and other nicotine products like vaping. And finally, tobacco-free Adagio Health advocates for public and private policies that ensure healthy places to live, work, and play. You can find out everything there is to know about tobacco-free Adagio Health at their website, tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. Thank you so much for supporting VBC, and our programming helps keep the lights on, as we like to say in the nonprofit world. Also, we have a new Scuttlebutt today. I host that separate from our happy hours periodically. I go and I do our pre-recorded podcast, The Scuttlebutt. As you can see, it was Pat Hubble there from Canderful. Canderful is a really amazing nonprofit organization. They help transitioning military veterans with the interview process. Now, we have lots of organizations that will help you transition out of the military and, find work, network. Canderful is there built specifically to help you with the interview process. So if you know anybody who's transitioning out, who might trying to be looking for a job, they may not be sort of, warmed up with the whole interview process. This is free. You can go to Canderful, you can sign up. They pair you with somebody, one of their 150 plus volunteer interviewers, and they will run you through a couple interviews, give you tips, pointers, help you get comfortable and ready for your interview. If you would like to give a listen to the Scuttlebutt, please do. It's a great conversation that I have with Pat. And I will say, as a spoiler, inside that video that we put up of the Scuttlebutt, I have a couple things that happen here with a bathroom reno and babysitter, and all these things start happening during the podcast. We thought, let's cut this out. But then Pat said, why not keep it? She's like, this is a perfect opportunity to know that whenever you're doing an interview, things happen. And how do you roll through it? So I kept it all in there. Better than just doing a blooper reel. It's fun to have just chaos just ensues. So it's a lot of fun. I had a great time with Pat. She loved the podcast, and Canderful, check them out or send them on to someone who may be looking to beef up their interview skills. I'm really excited to talk about this next podcast because this is a special 8-part miniseries. This is called Lioness, the Origin Story. Those of you who joined us several weeks ago for the documentary screening of Lioness, that was Daria Summers, the director, and we had several Lionesses on, Shannon Morgan being one of them. Well, Paramount Plus, kind of like Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, they have their own streaming. Paramount Plus created a show called Lioness, Special Ops Lioness. It is a fictional take on what the Lioness program could become. CIA, Special Ops, women in CIA and Special Ops. Well, the Paramount Plus show is pretty good, but it doesn't really pay homage to the origins of the Lioness story. Shannon being in the Army. A lot of outlets have reported that the Marines started the Lioness program, when in fact the Marines eventually took the Lioness idea and created the FET teams, the female engagement teams, which then also expanded and became part of CIA and sort of the culture, sort of culture teams that are involved with women. The Army used women back in Iraq 2003 because men couldn't, they couldn't pat down women and children. They couldn't search them. So they brought in women, brought them outside the wire to help out with this. The problem is that there was a combat exclusion policy, and they were in Ramadi, and they got into combat. So this podcast, Daria connected with us, said, hey, I would love to do a response, a history lesson on what the Lioness program was. Let's bring on Shannon Morgan. Let's talk to other Lionesses. Let's talk to Colonel Brinkley, who started the Lioness program. And let's do a podcast in response to the Paramount Plus Special Ops Lioness. So every week for the next 4 or 5 weeks, we are doing a review of the TV show. We're talking about the themes that ring true within that, with real life Lionesses, real life Marines, and what parts of it just didn't really work, and why they need to dive back into the history of this program more and really respect the fact that who these women were and what they went through. So again, check this podcast out if you can. It's only an audio, so you can't really watch it, but you could go on YouTube and listen to the audio. We have 3 episodes up, with a 4th one being recorded tomorrow and released as well this week in response to the Paramount Plus's 4th episode of Special Ops Lioness. And I can't say enough good things about the conversation that we have on this podcast. It is incredible. And the history that you're going to learn is essential. It's something that I think VBC can hang its hat on. We are here, like we said, connecting, educating, healing, inspiring, and we're always here about military topics and military history. And you're getting all of this in this podcast. I get shivers thinking about it because I'm just amazed that I get to be a part of these conversations happening. Can't wait for you to listen. And if you have ideas or thoughts about it, please email me. I'd love to hear them. As for next week, we will have on Brett Crozier next Monday night, Happy Hour. I'll be hosting again. Very excited to have him on to talk about his book, Surf When You Can. If you remember the name Brett Crozier, during COVID, he was the one who wrote a letter, I believe Todd, was it the president or Congress?
I think it was to Congress.
Congress. He was sticking up for his sailors. He was removed from his command, and he ended up retiring after this long 30-year career. But Brett's not shy about talking about it. He wrote this wonderful book. We're going to have him come on, talk about his career, his experience. Really looking forward to having him on. He's a great guy. So please join us next Monday night, August 14th, 7 p.m., same time as always, to talk about Brett Crozier. And let's see, I'll just go ahead and stop share here. And we will, at this point, move on to our main guest of the night, Marv Truhe. But before I do that real quick, Marv, sorry, I needed to mention, if you have any questions, so Marv's going to have a presentation for us about the USS Kitty Hawk and the race riot. During that presentation, if you have any questions that pop into your head, please put them into the chat, because after the presentation, we'll have time for questions. So be sure to use your chat function, and Todd and I will be monitoring that during the presentation, and then we'll come back to that at the end. As for what we have going on now, Marv Truhe. He served as an officer in the U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps, the JAG, during Vietnam War. While serving as a JAG defense counsel, he defended 6 of the Black sailors charged with rioting and assaults in the USS Kitty Hawk incident. Marv was born in January 1945 in a farmhouse on a small farm in South Dakota. World War II was in its final year, and his parents had their hands full on the farm, raising crops, livestock, and children, which I know all about that world. Marv was the 4th child born in 4 years, and times were tough, not only for his family, but for most of the rest of the country. Now, eventually, he ends up in law school. While at law school at Northwestern Law Review, he received an officer's commission in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Upon graduation from law school in 1970, he attended Naval Justice School and then reported for duty at the U.S. Naval Station Law Center in San Diego. In his final year in uniform, he served as a military judge in special courts martial trials. Marv, thank you so much for joining us. Very interested in what you have to teach us tonight. I'd love to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for this invitation. I give a lot of talks to veterans groups, as you might imagine, and I'm especially looking forward to this one. As Sean mentioned, there's going to be ample time at the end for questions, And for me, I think the questions are the most interesting part because I've learned a lot in the last several months from giving talks to veterans groups, things that I didn't know about what were going on in the Navy at the time that I was actually on active duty. So the name of the book again is Against All Tides, the untold story of the USS Kitty Hawk race riot. I'm going to talk about the book, and I'm going to talk about how it came about. It was published last fall in October. The publisher from Chicago made a special point of delaying the publication several months so that it would come out literally on the 50th anniversary of the incident of which the book is about. And the book is about racial injustices, plural, racial injustices against young Black sailors who were serving aboard the Kitty Hawk during the Vietnam War. Next, the Kitty Hawk, massive warship. A lot of you veterans, I know that several of you, I have already learned, have in the Navy, and some of them, including one that served on the Connie, USS Constellation. I never did serve at sea. I was a landlubber as a JAG officer at the 11th Naval District in San Diego. But of course, the Kitty Hawk was massive, about a 4-acre flight deck. The crew complement at the time of the incident in October 1972 was about 4,500. It was made up almost equally between those on the embarked air squadrons as well as the complement of the ship's crew itself. And the incident occurred on the evening of October 12th, 1972, just after the Kitty Hawk had completed its air introductions into North Vietnam. And it was the 7th line period that the Kitty Hawk had in 1972. And those line periods typically lasted 40 to 50 days. This particular line period in October was already into about 30 days, and there were 3 more weeks even after the incident. Well, it was still online off the coast. And that night, after air operations had ceased, there were violent racial confrontations that broke out on board the ship. And when it was over, there were 51 Black and white sailors injured seriously enough that medical records were issued for them. The actual confrontations lasted for 6 hours, and they were taking place on several different deck levels. And the reason there were some serious injuries is many of the sailors, Black and white, were using makeshift weapons, dogging wrenches, pipes, broken off broom handles. And following that incident, the captain of the ship, Captain Townsend, who had come aboard just 4 months earlier, he ordered an investigation into it. And that investigation lasted for the next 2 weeks, even while they were continuing to conduct those daily air operations. But unfortunately, and this is the beginning of the injustices, he made it clear that they were not going to take any statements from any Black sailors who were victims of assaults, strictly statements from white sailors. And as a result, when it was completed, 2 weeks later, the captain charged 25 Black sailors with rioting and assaults, and not a single white sailor was charged. The reason I wrote the book is that I was stationed, as I said, back in San Diego. I'd been in uniform about 2 years at that time. And if you're a Navy lawyer at a law center, you sometimes prosecute and you sometimes defend. You actually alternate every few months. I just happened to be a defense counsel when the incident occurred. And when the 25 sailors were flown back to San Diego, I was assigned to represent 6 of them. So the book is a first-person account of my representation of those sailors. And I also had the benefit of getting statements and interviews with other lawyers, JAG lawyers and civilian lawyers, and several Kitty Hawk sailors, which I'll talk about next. So next slide. At the time, I'm 27 years old, again, no sea experience. And in the book, I try to give a pretty good idea what it was like, not only for the young sailors, but also for those of us who were defending them, what I call the defense team. And I'll read just a few excerpts from the book this evening. And this is the first one toward the beginning of the book. Quote, San Diego was sunny that morning, just like most mornings, when I drove up to the Law Center in my 1962 blue and white Chevrolet Impala. The Law Center was a quiet, nondescript, one-deck structure that looked over the San Diego harbor. As I pulled up, I noticed a large steel gray Navy vessel at the pier just beyond the palm trees on the front lawn. Although I was a U.S. Navy officer, I didn't have a clue what kind of vessel it was. It was probably because I hadn't paid much attention to such things during Naval Officer Indoctrination School. Every ship has a hull classification code. DE is a destroyer escort, LST a landing ship tank, and so on for more than 100 codes. We were supposed to memorize them, but for a bunch of soon-to-be Navy lawyers, we didn't see much point. An OIS classmate simplified it for us all by calling them GBBs and LBBs, great big boats and little bitty boats. After looking again at the vessel berthed across the Law Center, I figured it must be a GBB. Now, even as the Law Center was conducting the trials, and they lasted for 5 months. Now, keep in mind, these were individual trials for each of these young sailors, no group trials. I knew that it was an important story, and I especially wanted to make sure the story was preserved because most of the newspaper accounts and all the Navy accounts at the time were very one-sided. And so I began collecting the original source documents that I had available as a defense lawyer. And I ended up with several thousand pages. They filled up 5 banker boxes. And I've been carrying those banker boxes from residence to residence, my wife can attest, for the last 50 years. But they included the investigation reports, sworn statements, witness testimony, all of the hearing and trial transcripts, medical reports. And another very serendipitous thing that I came to appreciate when I began writing the book again a couple of years ago was that every evening after the trials, I would dictate into a cassette recorder what had happened that day, what was happening in terms of the trials, my interactions with other counsel, especially my interactions with my clients. And I actually started writing the book my last year in uniform when I was a military judge. I was thinking I was going to finish it within perhaps 3 or 4 years after I returned to my home state of San Diego or South Dakota to practice law. But it took me 49 years to again pick up the effort for reasons I don't have a very good explanation, other than it finally came the time when I thought I had to get the story out. And as I mentioned before, it was because all of the accounts up to that time were very one-sided. And I make a statement in the book that the unofficial Navy record and other published accounts would lead you to the conclusion that only black sailors were assailants and all white sailors were innocent victims. Next. One of the benefits of doing this book that I hadn't really counted on, very positive, was I got to connect with several Kitty Hawk sailors, some of them defendants, those that I hadn't even represented at the time, but who had gone through the trials. And those men are now grandfathers like myself, but they were very gracious in giving me their accounts and their memories of what happened. And I also tell at the end of the book what they are doing now. And the other thing that I did is I made contact, and I hadn't actually thought I was going to do this initially, but it occurred to me, what if I were able to contact a few of the other Kitty Hawk lawyers, both prosecutors and defense counsel? Well, contacting the JAG officers is very easy because we have a very close-knit group of JAG officers from San Diego. We have regular reunions. My wife and I hosted one in Colorado here 3 years ago. We had another one last fall in Indiana. We have another one in San Diego next year. So I contacted a total of 11 of those JAG officers And they gave me their stories to flesh out the book in terms of what was happening in several of the cases that I wasn't personally involved in. And I was able to reconnect with 5 of the civilian lawyers who had been retained by the NAACP and the ACLU. And that's a story in itself. Because there were only Black sailors charged, you can imagine there was a lot of distrust of the lawyers that the Navy, myself included, that the Navy was appointing to represent them. They frankly did not trust us to begin with. We had to earn that trust. And under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, anybody in uniform is entitled to have a civilian lawyer at his own expense. In this case, the NAACP and ACLU provided those lawyers at no cost, of course, to the young sailors. And so for several of my cases, I had a civilian lawyer sitting beside me. In some cases, they were Black civilian lawyers from Southern California. In addition to the investigation on board, Congress decided that they had to investigate this incident. And so they sent a special subcommittee to the Naval Air Station in San Diego. And they conducted several weeks of hearings. But unfortunately, just like the onboard investigation, they were not interested in hearing from any of the Black victims, any of the victims of white sailors assaulting Black sailors. And so with that restricted witness base, incidentally, it was a closed door hearing. Press was not allowed in. They were only hearing, with only a couple of exceptions, from white sailors and then from senior naval officers. And when they got done, they issued a report to the public. And this was nationwide news, these trials. And this is what the report, and this report came out the day before my first trial, which was the second overall trial to go at the Naval Law Center. Quote, "The subcommittee is of the position that the riot on Kitty Hawk consisted of unprovoked assaults by a very few men, most of whom were below average mental capacity, most of whom had been aboard for less than 1 year, and all of whom were Black. This group as a whole acted as thugs, which raises doubt as to whether they should ever have been accepted into military service in the first place." Now keep in mind, this is the official congressional report on the Kitty Hawk incident. And after citing that report conclusion, the very next statement in the book that I make is this: virtually every assertion in that statement is pure fiction. And I went about to establish the truth of what actually happened that night and what actually happened afterwards during those trials. I wrote the book to tell the whole story and to set the record straight. And that's why the subtitle is The Untold Story. When I got done, I had over 1,000 citations, endnote citations in my book. Now that's a lot of citations, even for a military history book. But I wanted it to be fair and balanced, and I wanted it to be credible, and I wanted it to have integrity. If I was writing a naval history, which I was, I wanted it to be fair. I am critical in the book, and to this day, of the coverage of the trials and critical of the investigations that took place and the one-sided conclusions. And therefore, I did not want to have my book commit that same offense of one-sidedness. And for that reason, I tell it from both sides. I do not hold back. There were many assaults made by Black sailors, for example, and I do not hold back because I want the complete story to be told. Next. Some of those in uniform, I've talked to veterans groups who actually flew the A-6E Intruders and also the F-4 Phantom jets. And those were the air squadrons on board at the time, and they were making the daily bombing runs. The flight operations lasted up to 12 hours a day, as I mentioned, for weeks on end. And it was highly stressful because for those young crew members, they were on duty 6 hours on, 6 hours off, around the clock for the 50 days of that particular line period. And others were working 12, 14, 16-hour days straight. And I talk about the stress of those young men in that situation. And I make this statement, quote, "Why don't we bring thousands of young men of different ethnicities and backgrounds together under these conditions, most away from home and family for the first time, and see what happens? What could possibly go wrong? Plenty, as it turns out." Next. Now, to set the stage, we have to go back 4 months before the incident when Captain Townsend came aboard. And from the outset, he had a very troubling take on military discipline on his ship. And that was totally discriminatory, totally one-sided. My book talks about the captain's mass that he had. And for those of you who are veterans, of course, the captain is the one that conducts captain's mass, non-judicial punishment. Sometimes you know it as Article 15s, no lawyers present. But that's how he handles interdisciplinary matters on board a ship. And in his case, he had several incidents, one-on-one, black sailors assaulting white sailors, several of those totally unprovoked. And in every case, he handed out the maximum punishment, busted in rank, maximum pay, and also in every case, brig confinement on board, and several of those with rations of bread and water. So very harsh punishments. But he was also faced with half a dozen cases of white sailors assaulting black sailors, also unprovoked, both on the ship and on shore. And in every case, with one exception, he either did not bring them to captain's mast or he dismissed all charges at captain's mast. The only punishment he handed out, and some of these were very brutal assaults on black sailors, was a $25 fine. As you can imagine, word gets around, even on a large ship, and the black sailors started holding meetings to talk about the grievances, and they asked both the captain and the executive officer to come and explain why there was such disparity in those punishments. And it's interesting because the executive officer was a black man, Commander Cloud, exemplarily senior officer who is really a hero in my book. And that's not my words, that's the words of several of the young men that were involved, because he was very active in breaking up those groups of incidents on board. And next is, so for some of you, this is the Subic Bay Naval Base, which of course no longer exists in the Philippines. Next is another view of the base in the foreground. In the background is Olongapo City. I've had several Navy vets talk to me about spending time at the Subic Bay Naval Base. And that's Liberty Town, Olongapo City, in the background, where on any given evening you could have 10 or 15,000 sailors on Liberty. Actually, after the trials were over, I was assigned to Subic Bay for several weeks to represent some sailors on an incident that occurred off the coast of Vietnam. But I spent a very short period of time at Subic Bay. Next. So getting back to the Kitty Hawk, everything that I've talked about set the stage for what happened the evening of October 12th, 1972. And I've already mentioned the injuries and so forth that happened, in addition to the 51 sailors who received very serious injuries. 3 of them had to be flown off the ship back to Subic Bay for further surgical procedures. There were dozens of others that were injured, but not seriously enough that they had medical records issued for them. Next. This is Seaman Apprentice Durwood Davis. Did not know him at the time. Lives in St. Louis, Missouri. Grandfather like myself. And his story was worth telling that evening, while he was walking down the passageway on the mess deck, 5 white sailors approached him armed with makeshift weapons and brutally assaulted him. And when it was over, he tried to make a statement, but they refused to take a statement from him. And 2 days later, they charged him with assault in a totally unrelated incident. Next. This is Perry Pettis. He worked on the flight deck, outstanding young man who was rising through the ranks. He was from a small town in Kentucky. And his story was that he was assaulted twice that evening. He was never charged with anything. And like the other ones, he was not allowed to make any statement about what happened to me. Next. As I mentioned earlier, one of the pleasures of doing this book, which I hadn't anticipated, was I got to meet these guys. And I met Perry last fall in October. We had a JAG reunion in nearby Indiana, and he lives in Louisville. And we got time to spend some time together. Of course, I spent hours with him interviewing. This particular picture was on the front page of the San Diego Union Tribune. They did a very nice story on Perry Pettis and the incident last fall. Next. This is a San Diego Naval Air Station. The Law Center is just across the Coronado Bay Bridge in the upper middle part of this photo. And when the incident was over, as I mentioned earlier, there were 3 weeks of further air interdictions before the Kitty Hawk returned to Subic Bay. And the Captain Townsend at that point decided to put all of the defendants in the brig in Subic Bay. Now, this is worth noting because it is one of the major racial injustices arising out of this incident. We're talking about pretrial confinement, presumed innocent. And in the military, it is virtually unheard of to have pretrial confinement. The vast majority, of course, in the brig are serving their sentences after being convicted. But he made the decision to lock them all up. And they were there for 3 weeks, and then they were flown here to the Naval Air Station, actually ahead of the Kitty Hawk. And that's when I was appointed to represent 6 of them. Now, at that point, the convening authority for the cases to go to trial was the commanding officer, Captain McKenzie, commanding officer of the Naval Air Station. And he made the decision to lock up all of those sailors in the brig in San Diego. Again, totally unprecedented, totally unwarranted. And we began challenging that pretrial confinement from the outset. And we, the JAG lawyers, as well as the civilian lawyers and the NAACP, we spent the next several months trying to get them out of pretrial confinement, unsuccessfully. We exhausted all of our legal remedies within the military system, including the highest level of a court of appeals in the military. And we even took it to the Supreme Court, or tried to. We were denied certiorari. So those young men languished in the brig for all of the months leading up to their trials. And over half of them were in solitary confinement or maximum confinement. Now you have to ask yourself, why would they have been put in solitary confinement? Well, it was because of the circumstances of their confinement and the conditions of their confinement and the way they were being treated in confinement, which I mentioned in the book in some detail, that they would lash out in terms of discipline, and then they would be put in solitary, and several of them never left solitary. And I tell this story about one of my clients who was in solitary confinement for 50 days prior to his trial. And when we finally went to trial, I had the opportunity to let him testify about the circumstances of his confinement. And this is another statement, excerpt from the book from this client. And to put it in context, he was in a solitary cell, but that particular day they had the cell door unlocked for administrative reasons. And he happened to see a fellow black sailor being brought to maximum from one of the other brigs. And this is what he said, quote, "I heard him screaming, for me. My friend hollered over to me, said they was ready to bring him to row 6. He screamed to me, 'Here they come.' So then I heard a lot of noise and banging. I hollered out, 'Let him go.' Tears filled my eyes and I felt like black bondage. I feared he needed help. So that's when I went forward to strike the guard. My relationship with him is as close friends. All the guards are white. By black bondage, I mean slavery." That's the impression I had. I got indefinite row 6. Well, that client survived solitary confinement, but another of my clients almost did not. He attempted suicide. He attempted to hang himself in his cell. And I was representing a group of some very depressed young men, most of them teenagers, mind you. And most of them have been charged, several of them falsely charged. And those conditions were just intolerable. Well, in every of those cases with those clients, I would have them seen by the base psychiatrist. In every case, after being seen by the base psychiatrist, they strongly advised to get them out of maximum confinement, get them back to a more livable situation, even if they were in a minimum barracks or something like that. And in every case, the Navy returned them right back to solitary confinement. As I mentioned, my book talks about racial injustices in the plural. Next. This is the brig itself. This happens to be where they had the maximum. These buildings, unfortunately, are no longer standing. Next. This is the law center, relatively small structure. And this was the site of several other injustices, and some of which led to unjust convictions. And one of the primary things that happened, next will be a photo of the courtroom itself. As you can see, this courtroom was relatively small, but it was packed with national press, daily coverage, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, LA Times, of course, the local newspapers in San Diego, and daily television coverage, because the courtroom was open to the press. And the injustice that occurred in this courtroom, among others, was that the government withheld all of the investigation reports from us defense counsel for 2 months. Even during the start of trials, we were unable to get them. And this is a blatant violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, because in the military, just like in civilian courts, the government is obligated to give all evidence of every kind, certainly the statements of witnesses that were made prior to trial, certainly the statements of our own clients, and yet the convening authority chose to keep those from us for 2 months. Now, to explain for those who are not familiar, the convening authority is the senior officer who is responsible for literally convening the court. He assigns the judges, he sets the trial dates, and he's the one in this case that actually swore out the charges against them, the final charges that they went to their trials on. And that was withheld from us, and we knew those documents existed because we had witnesses who said, I did make a statement. But we were forced to go to trial in many instances with witnesses who had prior statements, government witnesses, defense witnesses, and we were not allowed to get those statements. And we actually had to go to federal court in San Diego in order to get those documents. Now, when I talk about this sort of thing, it would be very easy to think that this is a disgruntled defense lawyer who's making up a bunch of this stuff, or at least embellishing it. But nothing could be further from the truth. And that is why I have so much citations in my book and so many references. And all of this is part of the book and an important part of the book, because this is exactly what was happening. Next. This one is a special young man, Cleveland Mallory, one of my clients. And I devote an entire chapter of the book to Cleveland. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. from Pittsburgh, by the way. His sister still lives there. As a matter of fact, his sister there in Pittsburgh helped me with the book, as did some other relatives of some of the sailors. And in his case, his story bears mentioning. He had been promoted to seaman from E1 to E2 to E3 in less than a year, and he had a responsible position of running the ship's store. In the evening of the incident, Cleveland was locking up the ship's store about midnight, and 3 white sailors from the air squadrons, we knew where they came from because they were wearing the vests that the air squadrons wear, and they assaulted him as he was coming out of his store, and one with a pipe broke several of his ribs. Cleveland Mallory tried to make a statement about the next day because he thought he could identify his assailants, and they refused to take a statement from him. And there was no investigation, no follow-up, even though he's severely injured. And a couple of days later, they charged him with rioting and assault in a totally separate incident, and an incident in which he was totally innocent. And I'm not talking about innocent in the sense of self-defense or innocent in the sense of some other reason. Literally, he was not involved, but a white sailor who had decided that he was going to get as many of the black sailors as he could, began making statements, falsified statements. And so when we went to trial, that white sailor testified that he saw Cleveland Mallory assault one other sailor that evening. Now, the interesting part of it, and the reason it's included in the book, is that when we asked that sailor how he even knew Cleveland Mallory, because keep in mind, we're talking about a huge ship. Cleveland was part of the ship's company. The sailor was part of the air squadron. They worked several decks away from each other. How he possibly even knew him to identify him. And he said that 3 months earlier, when the ship was in Hong Kong, in Port Call, he met Cleveland at a bar, the Pussycat Bar, and spent several hours with him, bought him drinks, and became friends with him. This was a preposterous story. And how did we counter that? Well, I put on the division officer for Cleveland Mallory after the white sailor had testified, and he testified that Cleveland Mallory had never been to Hong Kong. Cleveland Mallory had missed the sailing of the ship from Subic Bay 3 days earlier. He was still in Subic Bay when the white sailor claimed he was buying him drinks in the bar in Hong Kong. Now, despite that clear evidence of perjury, the military judge, a judge from a small town in Georgia, found Cleveland guilty and gave him a bad conduct discharge. Now, you can imagine the uproar in the courtroom over this, because everybody in the courtroom, press included, were just flabbergasted, shocked, as were we on the defense team. And of course, to say nothing of what it did to Cleveland Mallory. Totally innocent, totally falsified, clearly perjured testimony. Everybody in the courtroom knew that. Matter of fact, I had a Washington Post reporter told me, he asked to talk to me right after the verdict. He asked my reaction, and I said I was shocked. And I said, "What's your reaction?" And he said, "The only person in the courtroom who was not shocked by the verdict was the judge." And that's how blatantly discriminatory and racist that trial was. So what did we do about that? Well, we were really back on our heels, but we had this preposterous idea. A couple of us came up with the idea, what if we could get somebody to befriend the perjurer? And what if we could get him to admit that he lied? Well, that sounds like something you'd make up in a dime store novel. But that's exactly what we did. The NAACP agreed to put up the money to hire an undercover agent, and not just anyone. Billy Hicks was in his early 30s, a former Marine officer and a former FBI agent who had worked undercover in San Diego. And we hired him, and he befriended the perjurer, actually got an apartment next to him in San Diego on Coronado Island. And over drinks, over several evenings, had him admit on tape, he had taped him, hidden microphone within his shirt, admitting to the perjury, admitting that's how he hated Black people. And the NAACP then went public with those perjury tapes after we transcribed them at a national press conference in February of 1973 in New York City. And as a result of that, things began shifting because the embarrassment to the military justice system as a result of those perjury tapes, actually after, this is weeks after the trial, and was very, very significant. And at that point, things began changing as far as the Navy was concerned. It went all the way up to the Department of Defense. It went all up to the Secretary of the Navy, Chief of Naval Operations, when they realized what was going on in San Diego. And my book talks about several other incidents of injustices with withheld statements and so forth that led to convictions. And when it was over, we had what I call in the book some relatively positive outcomes. So the book has a positive ending, if you will. As positive as you can get when you realize what all these young men went through. We had overall a total of 6 outright acquittals. We had many instances in which the Navy began dropping charges or signing lesser charges, and the young men that were willing to plead guilty to some assault were allowed to plead to simple assault, not to rioting, and they were given very minor sentences. As a matter of fact, half a dozen were allowed to get out of the Navy early with honorable discharges, including Cleveland Mallory. He decided to do that after the treatment he had had in the Navy. He was through with the Navy as far as he was concerned. And on a very positive note, not a single one of those young sailors received a bad conduct discharge, with the exception of Cleveland, but his conviction, as you might imagine, was reversed on appeal. And the perjurer, it took me more than 6 months after the trials were over to convince somebody to bring charges against the perjurer, even though we had him on tape flatly admitting that he lied in the trial. And he I actually ended up being the only government witness against him at his courts-martial trial. He pled guilty to perjury. So that was another positive outcome. Now, as you might imagine, in a book of this sort, I do talk in general about racial discrimination. It's a very small part of the book. There are plenty of very excellent books written on the subject with people more knowledgeable than I am. And I don't purport to have any exclusive or particular knowledge about racial discrimination. I just happen to have some unique perspective from a snapshot in time of what was happening in the Navy for those few months to these young Black sailors. And I make this statement, quote, "Well-meaning people of all ethnicities, all beliefs, and all persuasions, who would never for a minute consider themselves to harbor any racial or other prejudices, are a product of their environments, upbringings, and life experiences. As such, they can hold prejudices without any inkling of how their statements or actions may come across to others in those situations which may never manifest themselves overtly. Their true character and feelings are revealed," end quote. Next. Another positive outcome was that the Chief of Naval Operations, Elmo Zumwalt Jr., some of you older veterans will remember him, certainly you Vietnam veterans will remember him. He had come aboard as CNO just 2 years before the Kitty Hawk incident. And if you recall at the time, he had 2 main items on his agenda. One was to fight discrimination in the Navy, and the other was to loosen up things in the Navy. If you remember, loosen up the dress code, long hair, mustaches, and so forth. He was actually criticized very soundly for that. But as a result of the Kitty Hawk incident and what happened during those trials, as well as another incident that occurred on the USS Constellation 3 weeks after the Kitty Hawk incident, this would have been in early November 1972 in port in San Diego, there was a sit-down strike by 120 black sailors who had the same kind of complaints about disparate disciplinary matters aboard the Constellation. They refused to come on board. They literally stood on the dock next to the ship and refused to come on board. And our hosts, Todd and Sean, have told me that at least one of you in the audience this evening was aboard the Connie during this period of time. So it'd be very interesting to hear from you about your memory of that. But as a result of these two incidents, and as a result of these trials, the Chief of Naval Operations made a specific crackdown on discrimination. And this is one of the statements that he made, quote, "It is self-deception to think that the Navy is made up of some separate species of man, that Navy personnel come to us fresh from some other place other than our world, that they come untainted by the prejudices of the society which produced them. They do not." And the other thing that he did is that he called to task the senior naval officers who he said were not carrying out his program of fighting discrimination. And he laid a hard line on the issue, and he called together in Washington, D.C., a group of senior officers, including many admirals. And from the book, quote, "Zumwalt then issued an unprecedented order telling all commands that in effect their careers may depend on how quickly they move to improve conditions for the growing number of blacks now serving the fleet. Never one to mince words, he stated that he invites Navy officers who do not view improved race relations as their critical duty right now to retire from the service," end quote. As I mentioned earlier, I learn a lot by giving these talks from Navy and other military veterans. And one thing I learned very early on, actually from the Broomfield Veterans Museum talk that I gave, which is in my hometown here in Colorado, was that immediately after the Kitty Hawk and Connie incidents, all military were required to attend classes on discrimination. And these classes were carried out over a series of weeks. And I didn't even know that at the time, but several of you veterans have told me they do recall that at that time they had to attend those classes. So another positive, I would say, as a result of these two incidents. One of the off questions I get, especially from veterans, is how has the Navy reacted to my book? Has there been pushback? Has there been any negative response? It's a very appropriate question and one you might expect. And I'm happy to say that it's been just the opposite. The vast majority of all my talks have been to veterans groups. And I've gotten so much positive feedback. That alone justified the time and effort I put into writing this book. And I made that clear in my book from the very beginning. I wanted it to be clear that I was not making an indictment of the Navy. I was making an indictment of individuals within the Navy, and some of them outside the Navy, for example, in the Department of Defense. And I make this statement actually in the preface to the book, quote, "I was honored to wear the uniform of a U.S. Navy officer and am proud of and eternally grateful for those who have worn military uniforms in defense of our country." You'll read about some of them here. There are others, however, whom I have less respect for, and you will read about them also, end quote. Next. One of the things that I was honored to do, just as I'm honored this evening to talk to you folks, is that I was invited this spring to the U.S. Naval Academy, and I spent 3 days on campus as their guest and had a chance to talk to the midshipmen about my book. And that was very special for me to be a guest of theirs, actually staying on campus at the time and meeting the young men and women. And in the talk that I gave, I got a lot of excellent questions from those young midshipmen. One of the other positive responses I got, which I'd like to share with you, is from Durwood Davis. I showed you his picture earlier. He's from St. Louis. He wrote, after he got the book, I sent copies of the book to all these young men, of course. After he got the book, he wrote me this in an email, quote, I received the book, and although it kind of ripped the scab off some old wounds, a lot of memories that I had either forgotten or suppressed come to the forefront. I'm truly glad you did this work. It's truly a story that needs to be told, as I found talking to other Navy veterans before and after I served have experienced the same kind of ill treatment. So if this opens some eyes and helps open the doors to change, I'm a happy camper. Thanks again. As I said, I felt so reinforced by the feedback that I've gotten, not only from folks like you, but also from others, and of course, by the young men that were involved. Next. That's the end of my presentation. If some of you think you might be interested in the book, I would suggest you go to my website, marvtruhe.com. It'll give you a lot of photos that aren't in the book. It'll show you some other excerpts from the book, where you can get the book. You can get it just about anywhere on Amazon, online, Goodreads, bookstores, Barnes and Noble, and that sort of thing. And so with that, we can turn to questions. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Marv, for that incredible history lesson. I know I have a fair bit of questions, and there's a lot of things here in the chat. To everybody tonight, you can raise your hand this way. You can also do the click on the emote at the bottom, the reactions, and raise your hand that way, and we'll be able to call on you. I see Elwin, I see you waving your hand with a question. I'm not sure if you put it here into the chat or not. But Elwin, did you, let's see, I can ask you to unmute. While we're waiting for Elwin to unmute, Marv, probably one of the first questions that I have is your relationship with your defendants. And you talked about having to build that trust. Can you talk a bit about how you were able to do that from the first time meeting them, learning about what went on, what their experience was, and then defending them in court?
Well, I talked about that in the book. It was very strange circumstances because I was meeting him in brig cells because the majority of them were in maximum. Very constrained circumstances. You're sitting next to them on a bunk, in many cases in maximum confinement, in solitary confinement. So that doesn't exactly engender any trust. And as I mentioned in the book, for all they knew, they were looking at another one of those white junior officers. And why should they trust us? But it happened very quickly, because once you started working for them and you realized what you were doing, it made a lot of difference. One of the things it's probably worth talking about is that I got involved so personally in representing these young men that I was threatened with a court-martial. And that is in the book. And it involved a situation 2 days before the Kitty Hawk got to port. A civilian lawyer asked to fly out to the carrier. And I thought, why not? He wanted to interview witnesses before the ship returned. And so I made arrangements with the air traffic controller at Naval Air Station to get him flown out. What I didn't know is that a civilian flying to a carrier, which is not yet back in home port, is still considered a warship. And I violated some obscure regulation. And so the convening authority, that's the man who convenes the court, the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station, he called me, and he, in no uncertain terms, told me he was going to remove me from the cases. And he had the power to do that. So that got my attention. And this was before the first trial ever occurred. Well, what did I do? I'm a junior officer. I filed a motion to have him removed as convening authority, a senior officer. And you can imagine the press that received. And of course, that's the kind of thing that got around in the brig when they found out that not just me, but the other Navy lawyers were willing to stick their neck out to represent these young men. He had violated several sections of the Uniform Code by threatening to throw me off the cases because he has to be totally impartial. Well, he didn't throw me off the cases because more cooler heads prevailed. I didn't get him thrown off as convening authority, so we had to deal with him for months. But the other thing that happened was that as a result, there was a statement made by 2 lawyers that they heard he wanted me court-martialed, which also.
Sure, you're deep into that, but national.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Marv. And real quick, it's 8 o'clock. We're going to take a very quick station break here. Just to remind everybody that is new to us that we are the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is creating communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We are talking tonight with Marv Truhe and hearing a fascinating story about the USS Kitty Hawk race riot and his defense of several of the Black defendants in that case. We have the new Veterans Breakfast Club VBC magazine that's out right now, hitting mailboxes. If you do not get this is a free quarterly magazine. If you do not
They
get
locked
this,
up the blacks.
Here we go. I'm sorry. I asked Elwin to unmute because I know he has a question, but we keep hitting him at the wrong time. Go ahead, Sean.
That's okay. If you don't get this magazine, it's because we don't have your address. Please send us the address to todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org or Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. And we'll make sure that you get a copy of this wonderful magazine. We hear nothing but great reviews on. Todd is the author extraordinaire of this cover to cover. It has everything from our upcoming events to wonderful veteran stories. Some you may have heard, like Barb Habula, who was a recent guest on VBC Happy Hour. So again, VBC, check us out at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Back to Marv here. Elwin, I don't know if we can unmute.
We'll ask Elwin. Before we get to Elwin, Bob Fleisch
Yes.
put a good question in the chat that I was going to ask. Whatever happened to the captain of the Kitty Hawk?
Now, that's a great question, and it's a question I get from every talk I give. And the last chapter of the book is devoted, it's entitled, Where Are They Now? I'm happy to report that the captain of the ship, his career was over. And he was, keep in mind, he's a decorated naval aviator, as are all senior officers on board carriers, as was the executive officer, the black officer. But his career was over. And it was because of what was coming out during the trial about his one-sided investigation. Of course, we brought all that out in the trials and in the hearings, and only charging black sailors and so forth. So he took an early out, and he was living in California at the time, and he was actually mayor of a small town, I think it was Walnut Grove, California, but he did some civilian work overseas for some civilian defense contractors, but his career was over. Now, unfortunately, the career of the executive officer was effectively over. As I mentioned in the book, he was a hero to many of those young men, and I call him a hero in the book because he really did stick his neck out, and to his detriment in terms of his relationship with the captain. At one point, I cite in the book, the captain told him that if he ever, well, at one point he was meeting with the black sailors to quiet them down, and he raised his fist in a black power salute, something he'd never done in his life. And the captain said if he ever did that again, he was going to be off the ship. You would never work with him again. This is talking about captain talking to the executive officer. Unfortunately, where did he go next? Also a decorated Navy aviator. His next assignment was heading up the Navy ROTC in a Texas university. Think about that. He should have been a captain of the ship had it not been for this incident. So I also talk about where the young sailors are now, what lawyers are doing, and that sort of thing. But yes, that's a great question. And I consider that, may sound vindictive, but I consider that a positive outcome of what happened to Captain Townsend.
Following up on that, Bob Von Bargen asked, what was Captain Townsend's background?
He was, as I said, a decorated naval officer, aviator, and he had flown, I think initially in the Korean War, and then had flown in Vietnam. And at the time, of course, he was the captain of the Kitty Hawk. He was only on board for, I think, about 14 months. Yeah, and the executive officer also decorated, Distinguished Flying Cross for both of them. So that, you know, they were true veterans with outstanding credentials. And I didn't hold back on that. At the beginning, when I introduced these individuals, I talk about their credentials, including the Marine captain, for example, who's head of the Marines. Like I said, I wanted it to be fair. I wanted it to be balanced. And I wanted to tell the complete story without embellishing anything.
Chris Parolo, you have your hand up.
Yes, Mr. Truhe, welcome. Chris Parolo, United States Navy Reserve, retired. Following up on what was just said here, you've told us about his military background, but I am very curious about the man, a captain like this. What is his upbringing, his origins? What could have instilled certain beliefs in this man that he took into the situation? That's a follow-up to the last question.
Right. I don't give you in the book, Chris, his background, civilian, but I do the judge. And that's why in the book, I talk about what we call the more subtle forms of discrimination by people who have prejudices, but do not believe they have prejudices. Because I'd like to give the best possible impression of people. I would hate to think I would judge them harshly. I could say these were blatant racists, but I could also say, and I imply in the book, that these are people who truly believe they have no racist feelings. For example, the judge in the case, small town from in Georgia, that was his background. The day before this trial, he was asked, and he was quoted in the press, whether he had any racial prejudices. And he says, I honestly believe I do not have any racial prejudices. Now, I actually served side by side with him as a military judge for another year, and he actually believed that. And yet he was capable of convicting Cleveland Mallory on totally trumped up testimony. So yes, that's the kind of thing that I want, I guess, people to think about. And this wasn't my idea. A Black attorney who worked with me, hired by the NAACP, Ben James from San Francisco, he sat with me in several of my trials. He's the one that made that statement, 40-year-old Black man, about one of the most insidious forms of racism is that from people who truly believe they harbor nothing. And getting back to your question, Chris, about Captain Townsend, I quote him in the book as saying when the ship arrived that there has been no discrimination. This is after all these one-sided masts that he had. And he even made the statement to the Congressional Committee, also in the book, that nobody with any racist tendencies could ever be made captain of a carrier. He believed that.
My original question then, and this is drilling down to the heart of the matter, these incidences aboard the Kitty Hawk, I'm trying to understand motivation. Was it pure bigotry or prejudice? Was it stress of mission, personal conflicts and feuds, which then bubbled out to other people? Or were they also caught up in the politics of the time, beginning in 68 and 69 and 70, anti-war and the civil rights movement? Were these contributing factors to the very were these seeds to the incidents? Did you discover anything like that?
Well, I think that's another great question. And actually, Admiral Zumwalt, I quote him as saying he thought that even a stronger factor than discrimination was the stresses of combat. So it's the stresses was involved in that, but he also mentioned the discrimination. And as for the political matter, because there was a lot happening in the civilian life, there was a prior book on this subject, the only other prior book on the Kitty Hawk race riot about 12, 13 years ago. And in that book, a journalist who wrote the book, it's a fairly well-written book, he puts forth that statement that it was the politics that they brought from their hometowns. And I do not address that issue. I'm very careful in the book not to take any leaps or assumptions that are not supported. But I also have to say that he did the best he could in writing that book. But in writing the book at the very beginning, he says this, that he's basically apologizing, saying, I did not have access to any of the official records because the Navy told me they've destroyed all of the records of the investigation reports, all of the records having to do with the trials and so forth. Now, I believe him because this is 38 years after the incident, so they probably did destroy them. And that also means something that my book agent told me, that I may be the only person sitting on thousands of pages of original source documents. And I base it on those original source documents because I have the congressional hearings and so forth. As a matter of fact, the congressional hearings are still available online to this day, the congressional hearings, the one-sided hearings that I talk about. But getting back, I do devote an entire chapter, Chris, to the question of what caused it. And so, with the exception of the politics of the 60s, I talk about everything you mentioned.
Thank you.
Question from Ron Gianta. Have all of the Black Navy veterans given bad conduct discharges during this period of multiple events had the opportunity to file a claim with the Navy Board for the correction of military records for a change of their character of discharge?
Well, as I said, happily, none of them ultimately received a bad conduct discharge. For those of you who were in the military at the time, about the same time, about in 72, certainly by 73, they started giving general administrative discharges under honorable conditions, a new brand of discharge, because they were trying to get rid of all of those people that they thought shouldn't be in the military because of drug offenses. We dealt with a lot of drug offenses as JAG officers. So that was one of the things that they had general under honorable conditions, but no. Now, obviously, there were bad conduct discharges given unrelated to the Kitty Hawk. So I can't really answer that, I guess, in general. But on a positive note, a lot of them, including about half a dozen, took these general under honorable condition discharges.
Paul Wylazinski. I'm sorry, Sean. I just want to jump in just because I think Paul Wylazinski has some two very interesting points. Number one is the question, what was the influence of Black Power ideology on the race riot on the Kitty Hawk and elsewhere in the Navy? And number two, I like this insight. He said, he was aboard a destroyer at just this time, also involved in linebacker operations. And there was definitely racial conflict on board, but it never got out of hand because on a destroyer, you work so closely with each other, as opposed to a big carrier where there's a greater distance between the divisions, I guess. Marv, could you speak to that in any way? Is there a pattern here in terms of ships?
Well, I think there definitely is, and I think that's a good observation. One of the things, for example, Perry Pettis, he was the sailor that I got a chance to meet personally in Louisville last fall. He was on the flight deck. As a matter of fact, he was the foremost flight deck. He was staging aircraft. He grew up on a small farm in Kentucky, and he knew how to back up tractors and equipment. But he made the statement that he never saw any racist activity or discrimination against him when he was on the flight deck. He makes the statement, we all had to work together. Even a beautiful statement I put in the book. It was like a symphony, he said, when we worked together. Of course, keep in mind, they're conducting mostly night operations and staging aircraft and all the ordnance. But he says, once you got away from that, back to your point, a large ship, like a city, that's when he started hearing the racist taunts and that sort of thing. So that the idea that a destroyer, I have no experience, of course, with this, but that a destroyer where they were working shoulder to shoulder and a much smaller ship and probably knew each other a lot better, it would make sense that they were probably not seeing that. I had the same observation. I've got a brother-in-law here in Colorado who was a Marine during Vietnam, and he shared one of the Quonset huts with a black another black man, and he made the same observation. In Vietnam, we did not see that because we were having to look out for each other. So that's a great observation by the person who raised that point.
And there's a question and sort of a comment as well. Maybe you can speak to this. That were there similar situations in other branches of the military? I heard of a situation in the Army, but cannot verify the action. Ben Wright said in response to this that there was a race riot on Travis Air Force Base, California in '71. After that, the Air Force developed a lot of anti-discrimination training. Right.
Yes, there were other incidents. Of course, I don't talk about them because I'm very narrowly focused in terms of the incident and very narrowly focused in terms of time. I purposely avoided talking about what was going on in other places, or, well, one of the questions I get, has there been any change in race discrimination in the military in the 50 years since? And I have no particular unique perspective on that. Many of your listeners here would have a better perspective than I would, who have been in the military following that period. There's one question that I got from a veteran. My first talk to a veterans group, retired Army man, and this is what he asked me. It was a very unsettling question. He said, "You are a reserve officer, right?" I said, "Yes." "Would you have done the same things in terms of what you were sticking your neck out, bringing actions against a senior captain, and all the things that you were doing and going to federal court, all the way to Supreme Court trying to get him out? Would you have done that if you were a career officer?" Now think about that. That should be an unsettling question. I actually, when I would talk to the Naval Academy, one of my sponsors, she's a Navy captain there. She's actually heads up what they call the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. For those of you who remember, Stockdale was the admiral who was in Hanoi Hilton. So they named their ethical leadership program after him. When she heard about that, she says, "You need to talk to these midshipmen about that." Incidentally, they call men and women midshipmen. And I got the best line of questioning after that for a good 15 minutes. I especially remember one young woman who said, "What if I'm in that situation where I'm asked to do something or expect to do something by a senior officer? What should I do?" And it is a great question, but it's also should be a very unsettling question to us. And it's not unique to the military. I mean, every organization, corporation has its hierarchy, and that ethical question can come up in any number of instances. But that question kind of caught me off guard. My quick answer, this is all part of YouTube now, so you can see my answer at the time, but I said, I hope to God I would have acted the same way. Of course, I don't know that I would have if I'd been a career officer. Would I have been influenced otherwise? None of us know that unless we're in that situation.
I think one thing that maybe the biggest question I have for you, Marv, is given the signs of the times at that time and your upbringing, why were you so passionate about defending them and the social justice that you were pursuing at that point? It was a very different time in society.
Well, that's a good observation, because I grew up in a small farm community, actually on a farm, and then in a small agriculture community in South Central South Dakota, but it was right next to the Rosebud Indian Reservation, literally right next to it. And we had classmates, next door neighbors, that were Native Americans. We called them Indians back then. And that was also very close to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And my background was, my father was my role model. He was a very strong Christian, and he was always looking out for the underdog. He was always looking out for the Native Americans. One thing that he did in particular is that the church that I attended, it was a old wooden church, and when it came time for them to build a brick church, which now still exists in Winter, South Dakota, he convinced his fellow parishioners to raise money to take the old wooden church and move it to what we called across the tracks, to where many of the Indian community lived, because they did not have their own church. So I had a pretty good role model in my father. So even though we did not have Black people in our community, literally did not, we had a minority group, and there was nothing going on in that little community like the Jim Crow South. So don't get the wrong idea, but we heard plenty of Indian jokes and so forth that, as you might imagine. So that happened to be my background.
You know, Nars Khaliva, who is, by the way, going to be our special guest on Labor Day, September 4th, a Korean War veteran who faced his own battles with discrimination in the Army. Nars put in the chat here, other than Blacks, were there other minorities aboard the Kitty Hawk who were discriminated against, such as Filipino Americans or Latino Americans?
Not that I'm aware of, but again, you have to understand, I was never on board the carrier. And so everything that I have in the book it was extremely important. I keep repeating myself that it be totally backed by substantive evidence, physical recorded documents and evidence and testimony. So I am not aware of what was going on. I'm not to say it didn't happen. Of course, we all know, those of us who are in the Navy, that the Filipinos were given menial tasks. Of course, they could obtain citizenship by joining the Navy. But the same problem, and I do talk about it briefly in the book, that the Black sailors, among other complaints, were talked about being discriminated against in terms of promotions, in terms of jobs. They would stay in the mess cooking or compartment cleaning for much longer, that was their statement, than the white sailors were. And in many cases, it was because Durwood Davis, for example, said that they wouldn't let, even though he had outstanding records and he was constantly getting 4.0 rating, that they didn't think that he could work by himself. So they always assign a white sailor to work with him because they didn't think he was smart enough. And of course, I read from that congressional conclusion that about them being people of lower intelligence, which is just so disgusting. And I dispute that in the book, because I actually have access to their test scores both before and in the Navy. And they were all, that's absolute blatant lie that they were of lower intelligence. But coming from a congressional subcommittee, that should get everybody's attention.
Marv, you have an incredible trove of historical documents. Rick asked at some point, what's going to happen to those records?
Good question.
Well, it is a good question. As a matter of fact, for those of you familiar, a year and a half ago, we had a major fire here in Colorado, over 1,000 homes wiped out, and that fire got within 3 miles of our home. And luckily, just because of a wind change, it never got to our home. And that led my book agent to say, you have to make an extra copy of those records, which I did. Not all of them, mind you, but the ones that I cite in the book, I spent almost 2 months copying the relevant documents. And I've got that extra copy at my son's home. He's a lawyer that lives about 15 minutes away from me here in Colorado. So I have duplicates of those, but I have been asked, including from the Naval History and Heritage Command, about the possibility of donating my book, my records to the Navy. Hopefully this time they'll preserve the records, which didn't happen earlier.
I'm intrigued by Bill Boswell, who's retired Air Force colonel, also an attorney. What he put in the chat, he said, when the trial judiciary system came into effect in the early 70s, change happened. Trial lawyers were removed from the chain of command. I was a JAG on active duty from 71 to 78 and saw it in person. Most young JAGs, 03, were reserve officers at the time. We were feisty. So did you see a change in the early 70s when the trial judiciary system went into effect?
Well, without exception, everybody, except for the lieutenant commanders in the law center, were reserve officers like myself. We were in there for only the 4 years. Feisty is a great word, and I give equal credit to the other people in the defense team, not just civilians, but the fellow JAG officers. We were a feisty lot. And I think that, I'd like to ask that particular individual. I heard rumors, which I have never corroborated, that they're talking about, maybe they've already done it in the military, under the justice system, is removing convening authorities who are senior officers in the chain of command of the accused. Has that happened? That would be a positive.
It has not happened.
Has not.
No, they're talking about it mainly in the Senate. And they did that mainly because of male-female issues, shall we say, but it has not happened yet to the best of my knowledge. But you're right, I did use the word feisty, and I think that was an appropriate word. For my part, and this is true of the Air Force JAGs with whom I served, we didn't care what the commanders thought. We were going to do our jobs, and all of the staff judge advocates with whom I worked said, you do your job and get on with it. Don't worry about it.
Right. Well, the people that I single out were the exception by far. For example, the senior officers, the director of the law center, and the most senior JAG, Captain Ben Ruby at the 11th Naval District, they both really stuck up for me when I was threatened with removal. As a matter of fact, Captain Ben Ruby made a special trip that same evening to visit with the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station and to talk him out of removing me. So yes, I've been asked the question, did you have any personal ramifications by your aggressiveness? And the answer is absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I was the first person in my graduating class from Justice School in San Diego to be appointed a judge. So there was none of that happening. So I'm glad to hear what you're saying, that you found a similar kind of a reception. So these were definitely bad apples among another very honorable group of officers.
In the chat, I put Marv Truhe's website. If you are interested in his book, please visit his website and get a copy to help support this story. Unless there are any other questions here, I know that Ron has an announcement for our veterans, our veteran in the know, Ron Gianta. But Marv, I want to thank you so much for your presentation and your insights tonight, and especially your story. Thank you for taking the time to sit with us and talk with us about it.
Well, thank you. And if I could put in a last plug, if any of you do get the book and are so inclined, especially as veterans, I would really appreciate any reviews that you might give to Amazon. Apparently you have to buy from Amazon to get it, or with Goodreads or Barnes & Noble, because my publisher tells me that's very important. I'm a first-time author, so I'm very new to this. But if you could give reviews and identify yourself as veterans, that would be welcomed. Thank you again.
Thank you, Marv.
Ron, you have the floor.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. I received an email this week from a spouse of a veteran who's trying to get VA benefits because he was exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam. However, the mission was classified and it was never on his DD Form 214. And even when I worked for the VA, I've actually interviewed veterans who ended up in different parts of Southeast Asia on classified missions, and they call that black operations, and it's never, ever, ever been recorded anywhere except somewhere in some classified folder. So my heart goes out to these Vietnam veterans who perform classified missions in Vietnam, because the classification of their mission, and it becomes increasingly difficult for them to prove that they were exposed to Agent Orange toxins in all of those countries where now the PACT Act 22 has come up and given additional places where veterans could file a claim if they were exposed. But there are other ways to prove participation in missions leading to the exposure to toxins. If a veteran was TDY, and if there's any copies that that veteran may have retained of their TDY orders, or a copy of the travel voucher, the DD form 1351-2, that would be helpful in proving they were where they were, because every time a military member goes TDY, they have to file a travel voucher. Number two, did the aircraft land in Vietnam or any other country detailed to have toxin exposure for refueling and or supplies or cargo pickup? A copy of the aircraft manifest, pilot's log could also help, just like we're using Navy ship logs to qualify veterans under the Blue Water Navy Act, okay? Another thing that's really important, a lot of people don't think about, did they report to the on-base clinic for anything, whether it was for a shot, vaccination, or even a bad tooth, or a basic medication for anything? Medical records would be signed by an attending examiner or medic at the location of the treatment. And I actually got a veteran approved for exposure to Agent Orange because he had to have a tooth filled in Da Nang. One day, just one day, okay? Lastly, is the veteran in touch with anyone who they served with? A buddy statement completed by a member of the military who served with the veteran, and all who provides a buddy statement, and you can use a letter, a plain piece of paper, or the VA form 21-4138, attesting to the veteran's presence, in this case, boots on the ground in Vietnam. Each military supervisor, aircrew member, or commanding officer statement would support them in filing a claim for being exposed to Agent Orange. I have a number of veterans that I've helped when I worked for the VA, and they actually got buddy statements signed by a fellow military member attesting to the fact that they were where they said they were, okay? And a lot of this information is critically important. It's not in the handbook, but it's information that could help a veteran filing a claim when exposed to toxins, because it's just another piece of evidence to help them in their fight for benefits. And lastly, it's really important for every veteran to get hooked up with a veteran service officer like American Legion, DAV, VFW, AMVETS, whatever, to help them in their case in filing a claim for disability benefits. But I just wanted to bring up the point tonight, Sean, like we talked in the email, that there's a lot more to filing a claim than just a DD Form 214, because your DD Form 214 will not show any place where you were TDY unless you were discharged from that TDY location. So I tell you right now, a lot of our veterans who went TDY to different parts of the world, they were exposed to different things. Their 214s don't show that because they were on the ground for a few days and then back to where they came from, but they were still exposed to the toxins of that location. So it's really important that our veterans try to do other things to support them in their claims.
Thank you, Ron. And again, to Marv, I want to say thank you. And Henry Shepke, who we talked about earlier, our youngest viewer tonight, he said, before tonight, I had not heard of this incident. I always learn something on the VBC. So Marv, you are teaching consistently. There's a lot to be learned from your story and your book. Todd, any final thoughts before we sign off?
just want to thank Marv for, working on this book for 50 years and for getting it out there to the public. I mean, it's invaluable. So thank you so much, Marv. You've educated us tonight and inspired us also with your leadership.
Well, thank you for that. And one thing I should mention, I always respond to emails. And if any of you out there, veteran or otherwise, my email is very simple, marvtruhe@aol.com. If any of you want to write to me, I'm especially intrigued by the former Air Force JAG officer. I always follow up and engage and look forward to those. I'm retired and I just love those interactions. Like I said, that's one of the positives of the book that I never anticipated, was the ability to interact with all of you folks. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody here, and also in our chat. If you take 1 second to look there, there's a survey. Please click that link now. It takes you 2 to 3 minutes just to respond to this program. Let us know your thoughts, what we're doing great, what we maybe not be doing so great, which I can't imagine would be anything other than greatness. But you have your opinions. We'd love to hear them. Please send us your thoughts, and we look forward to seeing you next week, Monday night, 7 p.m. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Have a good week, everyone.